we had both, and I especially had done a lot of work on race and racial justice, racial equity over the years, and realized in retrospect that almost none of the work being done really engaged this question of how kids are taught about race, right? What they learn and how they learn about race. So that felt like a real big missing piece, which really became a prominent piece for us when we became parents. And when we looked around, there were actually very few resources aimed at parents of children, and especially very young children. So there was this big gap. And we thought, okay, maybe we can try to help fill that gap. Very early on, kids are um, developing racial sensibilities, right? And by the time they're 4 or 5 years old, they are developing things that look very much like racial bias. Most kids enter kindergarten with racial biases, right? So with preference towards some groups, typically white, with sort of preferences against other groups, typically people of color, especially Black Americans. So the point is that kids are learning about race very early, regardless of what we do or don't do. So the question is, what do they learn, right? How thoughtful and deliberate and informed are we, their caregivers, in teaching them or helping them to learn, in healthier rather than more dysfunctional ways? That's the opportunity when these ideas are first emerging and are much more malleable, right? Can be much more easily shaped in ways that are, again, more positive and healthy and accurate. We went with Embrace Race because we wanted to push back against the idea that race is something to be avoided or to be, quote unquote, colorblind about or color mute about, right? That we should pretend not to see it. We should not talk about it. We know that that's not true. We wanted to say, no, we're going to embrace it. We're going to be honest about it. We're going to be explicit about it. We're going to grapple with it, bravely. So that was, we wanted a more sort of affirmative, positive stance toward race than the kind of avoidance and fatigue that really characterizes how we collectively typically approach race. The first grant really helped us build an organization. We hired several people. We're still very small, but we were able to add significant capacity by hiring some staff for the first time. Right at Healthy Futures was the biggest part of an infusion of funding following the murder of George Floyd that allowed us to start doing all this programmatic work, right? To put some programmatic work into our production pipeline. And in 2023, a lot of that work will now be emerging from the production pipeline.